There is a specific kind of restriction that is not a wall and not a fence. It is a designation, a federal order. A sign at the edge of a map that reads, "No vessel approach within 2 kilometers," or "Permit required, permit not issued." Or, in this list, simply a treaty between 2 countries that has been arguing about the same uninhabited rock for 70 years and has recently decided to split it down the middle. Canada has more coastline than any other country on Earth. It has over 52,000 islands with names, and an estimated 30,000 more without them. The ones on this list are not the ones you cannot reach, because the logistics are difficult. Logistics are surmountable. The ones on this list are the ones you cannot reach because someone decided, officially and in writing, that you cannot. The reasons for those decisions tell you something true about ecology, about history, about geopolitics, and about what a government protects when it decides that a piece of land is worth protecting from the people who would like to stand on it. Some of these islands are restricted because of what lives on them. Some are restricted because of what happened on them. Some are restricted because of what is still in the ground from what happened on them. And at least one is restricted because 2 countries could not agree on who had the right to restrict it, which is a legal condition that produces its own specific kind of inaccessibility. By the time you reach number 1, you will have a working theory about what a country considers too important, too dangerous, or too embarrassing to share. Number 15, Île Bonaventure, Quebec Bonaventure Island, sits 3 kilometers off the tip of the Gaspé Peninsula and contains the largest accessible northern gannet colony in the world, which is a distinction that the province of Quebec discovered is commercially useful and ecologically fragile in a ratio that required a hard choice. For much of the 20th century, the island was accessible by ferry, and visitors could walk the trails to within viewing distance of the colony. The problem was the trails, and the visitors, and the specific behavior of northern gannets during breeding season, which is sensitive to human disturbance in ways that population data eventually made impossible to ignore. Access is now tiered, seasonal, and regulated in ways that effectively prohibit most visitors from the parts of the island where the colony is most active during the months it is most active. The ferry still runs, the designated trails are open. The cliff where 60,000 gannets nest in a mass so dense it appears from a distance to be a white geological feature, rather than an animal behavior, is behind a buffer. The reason for the buffer is the colony's documented response to proximity. Productivity rates, measured in chicks per nest per season, dropped measurably in years with higher visitor traffic. The province ran the numbers and drew the line. Picture this. You are on the ferry crossing the 3 kilometers from Perce, and the island is getting larger. And the smell arrives before the sound, which is the specific smell of 60,000 seabirds and their accumulated presence on a piece of land that has been processing them for longer than the province has existed. Then the sound arrives, which is not bird call exactly, but something closer to a stadium finding its frequency. You will see the colony from where the province has decided you can see it, which is a position that is instructive and not sufficient. And the gap between those 2 things is the entire argument for a restriction that nobody who has smelled that smell will tell you is wrong. Number 14, Triangle Island, British Columbia Triangle Island, sits at the northwestern tip of Vancouver Island, which means it sits at approximately the most exposed position available on the Pacific coast of Canada, and the Pacific coast of Canada is not modest about its weather. The island is a British Columbia Ecological Reserve, which means access requires a permit, and the permit is not routinely issued, and the practical effect of both of those things combined with the island's position in one of the most reliably violent stretches of water on the continent is that Triangle Island has not been regularly visited by non-researchers since the lighthouse was decommissioned in 1920. The lighthouse crew left because the posting was considered genuinely dangerous. Winds above 100 kilometers per hour are not exceptional here. The island's home to the largest tufted puffin colony in Canada and one of the largest rhinoceros auklet colonies on the Pacific coast. The restriction exists because the colony requires it. The weather enforces it. The combination of a government designation and a marine environment actively hostile to small vessel navigation has produced an island that is, in practical terms, more inaccessible than most places that require a passport. Picture this. You are in a research vessel 50 meters off Triangle Island on a July morning, which is the closest you are legally and practically likely to get. And the cliffs are covered in birds in a way that makes the cliffs appear to be moving. The wind is doing something specific to the water surface around you that the vessel operator is watching with more attention than they are giving the view. The island is right there. The permit is not in your pocket. The weather is making its own argument, and it is a more immediate argument than the permit ever was. Number 13 Mandart Island, British Columbia. Mandart Island sits in the Haro Strait between Vancouver Island and the San Juan Islands, and is administered simultaneously as a British Columbia Ecological Reserve, which means no public access without a scientific permit, and as a site of ongoing cultural and spiritual significance to the Hulukuminum-speaking peoples, who have a relationship with this island that predates the province and the country, and the category of ecological reserve by several thousand years. The island contains cormorant and gull colonies, and evidence of human occupation spanning at least 2,500 years. The archaeological record is embedded in the same landscape the birds currently use. The restriction is therefore layered in a way that single-origin restricted islands are not. The province restricts access to protect the colony. The First Nation asserts a stewardship interest that predates the province's authority to issue or withhold permits. The two restrictions are not identical and are not always aligned, which is a jurisdictional condition that the island exists in, regardless of whether the relevant governments have resolved it. Picture this. You are on a kayak in the Haro Strait on a calm morning in May, and Mandart Island is visible from where you are paddling, and the cormorant colony is audible before it is visible. Then you know what you know about it. That the layer of colonial classification sitting on top of a much older human relationship to that land is a condition the island holds in its record. And the restriction that prevents your landing reflects two different versions of why you should not be there, and only one of them is about the birds. Number 12 Race Rocks, British Columbia Race Rocks, is a cluster of granite islets 12 kilometers southwest of Victoria. Sitting in the Juan de Fuca Strait, where the tidal current runs fast enough that the navigation charts describe it with language that professional mariners read carefully. The islets are a British Columbia Ecological Reserve, an internationally recognized marine protected area, and a heritage site for the Tsuki Nation. Success is restricted by designation and reinforced by the current, which is not a metaphor. The tidal race that gives the islets their name runs at speeds that exceed the capability of most recreational vessels in conditions that change faster than most recreational vessel operators can usefully respond to. The combination of legal restriction and physical hazard has produced an ecosystem that is, relative to its distance from Victoria, among the most intact remaining on the coast. Stellar sea lions haul out on the rock numbers that crowd the available surface. Peregrine falcons nest in the lighthouse structure that has stood on the main islet since 1860. The restriction is enforced partly by statute and partly by water. Picture this. You are on a whale-watching vessel, passing race rocks at a legal distance on a September afternoon, and the sea lions number in the hundreds, and the smell is the specific smell of a healthy pinniped colony in late season, which is not subtle. The current around the islets is doing something visible to the water surface that your vessel is navigating around rather than through. Victoria is 12 kilometers behind you. The islets are 12 kilometers from the provincial capital and look like something that should not still be possible this close to anything. Number 11, Akimiski Island, James Bay. Akimiski Island sits in the southern reach of James Bay and is the largest island in that body of water at roughly 120 kilometers long, which makes it larger than Prince Edward Island, and it is a Canadian Wildlife Service migratory bird sanctuary, where access requires a federal permit that is not issued to the general public. The island is also within the traditional territory of the Omushkigo Cree, and subject to land use provisions under the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement. It supports nesting colonies of Canada geese, common eider, and lesser snooksy in numbers that make it one of the most significant waterfowl breeding areas in eastern Canada. It has no permanent settlement. It has no infrastructure. The nearest community with a landing strip is Attawapiskat, on the Ontario mainland, which is itself a community that the national news cycle has found primarily in the context of crisis rather than geography. Picture this. You are in a floatplane banking over Akimiski Island on a June morning, and the island below you is flat and green, and the wetlands that cover its interior are full of nesting birds in a density that is legible from altitude. The Canada Goose apparel brand has made several $100 million from the name of the species that nests here in extraordinary numbers. And the island they nest on is not on the itinerary that the brand's marketing department produces. That is either ironic or simply accurate, depending on how you choose to account for the distance between a name and its origin. Number 10, Coates Island. Hudson Bay Coates Island sits in northern Hudson Bay and is a Canadian Wildlife Service migratory bird sanctuary that shares with Akimiski the distinction of being large, federally protected, and almost entirely absent from the Canadian public consciousness. The island is approximately 140 kilometers long. It supports one of the largest thick-billed murre colonies in the Western Hemisphere, with estimates ranging from several 100,000 to over 1 million breeding birds, depending on the survey year. It has no permanent settlement. The nearest community is Coral Harbor on Southampton Island, which is itself remote in a way that requires a flight to reach from any major Canadian city. The restriction layers over a practical inaccessibility that would exist regardless of the designation. Hudson Bay is not a body of water that recreational vessels routinely navigate. The weather, the ice conditions extending into late spring, and the distance from infrastructure combine to produce an effective barrier that the federal sanctuary designation reinforces rather than creates. Picture this. You are reading the description of Coates Island in a Canadian Wildlife Service document, and it describes a murre colony of extraordinary scale on an island the size of a small province, and you realize that this island exists in the same country as Toronto and Vancouver, and that the mental map most Canadians carry of their own country does not contain it. The restriction is federal. The obscurity is total. The murres are fine. Number 9, Mansell Island. Hudson Bay Mansell Island sits between Coates Island and Baffin Island in Hudson Bay and is, at approximately 160 kilometers long, larger than both. It is not a designated sanctuary. It is not a national park. It is not the subject of a federal protection order of the kind that generates public-facing documentation. What it is remote in a way that functions as its own protection. In a landscape where ice closes the navigation window to a few weeks per year, and the logistics of reaching the island require resources that are not available to the general public and are rarely assembled by anyone else. The Inuit have a historical relationship with the island that predates the Canadian state, and that continues in the form of traditional land use not organized for external visitors. The island has no permanent settlement. It appeared in the news cycle once in recent decades in the context of a resource exploration survey and then disappeared from it. The effective inaccessibility here is not a legal designation. It is the combination of geography, climate, and a logistics equation that the island's distance resolves before the question of permission becomes relevant. Picture this. You are trying to plan a visit to Mansell Island, and you are working through the logistics in the order they present themselves. Charter aircraft from where, and landing where on an island with no airstrip, in which weather window, with what support, and sanctioned by whom. And the answer to each question produces the next question until the list is longer than any reasonable itinerary, and the island is still there, unchanged and indifferent, in the middle of Hudson Bay. Number 8, Bylot Island. Nunavut Bylot Island sits at the northeastern tip of Baffin Island and is entirely contained within Sir Melick National Park, which means it is administered by Parks Canada, and access requires authorization that takes into account conditions that distinguish Bylot from most of the national park system. The island has one of the highest concentrations of polar bear denning habitat in the eastern Arctic. It has walrus haulouts. It has thick-billed murre colonies that rank among the largest in the world. It has a landscape of glaciers and coastal tundra that exists in a state of ecological integrity, measurable precisely because human traffic through it has been, by design and by distance, minimal. Parks Canada manages access in a way that prioritizes research over recreation, acknowledging the island's position at the intersection of polar bear territory, seabird breeding habitat, and Inuit traditional land use. The practical result is a national park that most Canadians could not find on a map, and that virtually none of them will visit in their lifetimes. Picture this. You are a Parks Canada researcher on the island in July, and the tundra is briefly green in the way Arctic tundra gets briefly green in July, which is a green that is more intense than it has any right to be at this latitude. And a polar bear sow with 2 cubs is visible on the beach below you, at a distance that your training has made you specific about maintaining. The island is a national park. The park is technically yours as a Canadian citizen. The bear's assessment of that claim is not documented but can be inferred. Number 7, Resolution Island. Nunavut Resolution Island sits at the entrance to Hudson Strait off the southern tip of Baffin Island and was the site of a distant early warning line radar station that operated from 1958 through the end of the Cold War and left behind a contamination legacy that the federal government's remediation program addressed in stages and declared substantially complete, and that independent environmental assessments have engaged with, in terms that suggest the declaration and the data are not the same document. The W-line stations used polychlorinated biphenyls in their electrical equipment and transformer systems, and the PCB contamination at Resolution Island was among the most significant of any DW-line site. The remediation removed material. The monitoring that followed found residual contamination in sediment and marine mammal tissue near the island, at levels that the monitoring reports describe in the language that environmental science uses when the numbers are present. But the regulatory threshold is the instrument of interpretation. The island is not formally restricted as a national park or wildlife sanctuary is restricted. It is restricted in the way that a site with a documented contamination history and limited monitoring infrastructure is restricted, which is that the people with the authority to send you there have not done so. Picture this. You are reading the Federal Remediation Completion Report for Resolution Island, and the report uses the phrase risk managed in the context of residual contamination, and you understand that risk managed is a description of a decision about acceptable outcomes rather than an absence of risk, and the island is still there at the entrance to Hudson Strait. Its history in the ground at concentrations the monitoring continues to measure. Number 6. Makia Seal Island. Bay of Fundy Makia Seal Island is a small island in the outer Bay of Fundy that is administered by the Canadian Wildlife Service as a migratory bird sanctuary and simultaneously claimed by the United States as part of Maine, which makes it one of the last unresolved territorial disputes between the two countries, and which produces a specific administrative reality. Canada manages it. The United States disputes that management. Both countries have maintained this position without resolving it since the treaty that ended the War of 1812 drew lines that both countries subsequently interpreted differently. The island supports one of the largest Atlantic puffin colonies in the Western Hemisphere. The Canadian Wildlife Service allows a small number of permitted visitors per day during the breeding season, in a program that is oversubscribed by a ratio that makes the lottery for national park backcountry permits look casual. The United States does not formally prohibit American citizens from visiting what it considers American territory, but Canadian management of the landing permits means access is controlled by Ottawa, regardless of what Washington considers the island's sovereign status. Picture this. You are a bird watcher who has applied for one of the permitted landing slots and received it after a wait of several years, and you are in a small boat approaching the island on a calm morning in July, and the puffins are visible from the water in the numbers that made the waiting make sense, and the territorial dispute that governs the permit you are holding is a geopolitical condition that is not visible from the boat, and that the puffins have declined to organize their breeding schedule around. Number 5. Scott Islands, British Columbia. The Scott Islands are a group of 5 small islands off the northern tip of Vancouver Island that contain the largest concentration of nesting seabirds in Pacific Canada, with breeding populations of Cassin's auklet, rhinoceros auklet, tufted puffin, and fork-tailed storm petrel that represent a significant fraction of the global breeding population of several of those species. The islands were designated a Marine National Wildlife Area in 2018 after a decades-long campaign by conservation organizations concerned that vessel traffic was disturbing the colonies during breeding season at a scale that productivity data had begun to reflect. The designation includes a vessel exclusion zone prohibiting approach within 2 kilometers without a permit, and the permit is not issued to recreational visitors. The fine for violation of the vessel exclusion zone is among the highest available under Canadian wildlife law. The Marine National Wildlife Area status extended protection into the water column, producing a restriction that is enforceable at the vessel level rather than only at the landing level. Picture this. You are on a sailing vessel in Queen Charlotte Strait, and the Scott Islands are on your chart, and you are drawing the 2-kilometer exclusion circle around them to confirm your intended track is outside it. And inside that circle, on islands you cannot approach and cannot land on, are several million birds doing what several million birds do during breeding season. The restriction is 2 kilometers. The fine is specific. The birds are indifferent to both. Number 4, Sable Island. Nova Scotia Sable Island is a crescent of sand 350 kilometers southeast of Halifax that is 42 kilometers long and, at its widest point, less than 2 kilometers wide, which makes it a geographic improbability in addition to a restricted access area. It became a National Park Reserve in 2013, which means visiting requires a permit, and the permit process is not designed to produce high visitor volumes, because the island's ecological value depends on conditions that high visitor volumes would modify. The island has approximately 500 wild horses, a population that has been self-managing since the 18th century, and that Parks Canada manages with the specific goal of non-intervention. It has the largest gray seal breeding colony in the world, approaching 400,000 animals. It sits in the middle of one of the most historically dangerous stretches of Atlantic shipping lane, with more than 350 documented shipwrecks on its surrounding shoals. The permit system allows a small number of visitors per season via charter flight, at a cost that reflects the distance, the logistics, and the deliberate friction the permit process is designed to produce. Picture this. You are one of the few hundred people per year who have made the flight, and you are standing on a beach on Sable Island in August, and the gray seals are on the beach in numbers that require recalibration of what the word colony means. And a group of wild horses is moving along the dune crest above you, with the specific purposeful indifference of animals that have not learned to assign significance to human presence, because human presence has been, by design, rare. The island is 350 kilometers from Halifax. The permit took months. The horses have been here 300 years and have not been asked for documentation. Number 3, Hans Island. Arctic Hans Island is a small, uninhabited island in the Kennedy Channel between Ellesmere Island and Greenland that was the subject of a bilateral territorial dispute between Canada and Denmark, lasting from at least the 1970s until 2022, when the boundary treaty divided the 1.3 square kilometer rock approximately in half. The dispute was notable for its specific form of diplomatic expression. Canadian and Danish officials would periodically travel to the island, plant their national flag, leave a bottle of whiskey or schnapps depending on nationality, and depart, a ritual that the media described as the world's most polite border dispute. The 2022 treaty resolved the sovereignty question and created what is now the only land border between Canada and the Kingdom of Denmark, which passes through an island with no permanent residence, no infrastructure, and no particular reason for anyone to visit it, except that for 40 years its ambiguous status made visiting it a geopolitical statement. The restriction that now applies is the one that applies to a border. You can be on the Canadian side or the Danish side, and crossing without authorization requires paperwork that was not required when the island's status was simply unresolved. Picture this. You are on the Canadian section of Hans Island, and you are standing as close to the treaty line as the coordinates allow. And on the other side of an invisible division is territory that is technically a component of the Kingdom of Denmark, which means that you are approximately 2 meters from Europe, on an island that nobody visits, in a strait that is mostly ice. The whiskey was Canadian, the schnapps was Danish, the line is permanent, and the island does not care. Number 2, Ellesmere Island. Nunavut Ellesmere Island is the 10th largest island in the world, and the site of Kootenay National Park, which translates from Inuktitut as top of the world, and which is the second most northerly national park on Earth. It is 860 kilometers from the North Pole. Entering the park requires a park use permit that includes preparation documentation, emergency communications equipment, and evidence of competency in Arctic travel that Parks Canada reviews as part of the approval process. The restriction is therefore not solely a permit requirement. It is a competency gate. Cold weather survival, navigation in a landscape without infrastructure, medical self-sufficiency for periods measured in days, and the ability to operate in polar bear country without support. The island has had no permanent human settlement since the Thule Inuit sites that the archaeological record documents. It is one of the few places in the Canadian National Park system where the permit exists alongside a genuine acknowledgement that the park cannot guarantee anything about your experience, except that it will be cold, distant, and entirely your responsibility. Picture this. You are at the northern edge of Kootenay in late July, which is the only month that describes warm by any useful definition of the term. And the Arctic Ocean is in front of you, and the distance to the nearest Canadian community with a hospital is measured in flights. And the landscape produces in some people a specific and irrational feeling of being exactly where the world is supposed to be, and in other people an equally specific and rational assessment of their current exposure. The park permit is in your pack. The park cannot accompany you. The distinction between those two things is the island's permanent condition and yours, temporarily, by choice. Number 1. Experimental Lakes Area, Ontario. The Experimental Lakes Area is a collection of 58 small lakes in the Canadian Shield in northwestern Ontario, where access is restricted to researchers with approved project permits. And it is on this list because it is the restricted body of water in Canada that has produced the most consequential scientific findings about what human activity does to freshwater ecosystems. And the restriction is the condition that made those findings possible. And the findings are findings that the industries whose activities produced the conditions being studied have, at various points, contested. Researchers at the ELA conducted the definitive studies on lake acidification from atmospheric sulfur deposition, which produced the acid rain regulatory framework. They conducted the definitive studies on phosphorus loading in freshwater, which changed detergent regulation globally. They are currently studying pharmaceutical compounds, microplastics, and neonicotinoids at concentrations that replicate exposure levels found in Canadian water bodies outside the research area. The restriction is what produces the scientific control. The control is what produces the findings. The findings are what produce the regulatory fights. And the regulatory fights are what produced the federal government's 2012 decision to defund the ELA, which was subsequently reversed after a scientific and public advocacy campaign, which is a sequence of events that tells you something specific about what a government does when a piece of restricted land produces findings that are expensive to act on. Picture this. You are a researcher at the Experimental Lakes Area, adding a compound to a study lake at a concentration that replicates what is found downstream of a municipal water treatment plant in a mid-sized Canadian city, and you are going to spend the next several years documenting what that concentration does to the lake's biology. And the documentation will be thorough and peer-reviewed, and will eventually require a policy response that the industries producing the compound will contest in regulatory proceedings that will last longer than your study. And the lake will continue processing the information on its own timeline regardless of the proceedings. The restriction is what makes the science possible. The science is what makes the restriction uncomfortable for specific interests. That relationship is not incidental to this list. It is the reason this entry is number 1. There is a pattern in these 15 locations that is worth naming before the video ends. Most of the restrictions exist for one of 3 reasons. The first is ecological protection, which is the most legible reason and the one most likely to appear in official documentation without qualification. The second is jurisdictional complexity, which is the reason that involves treaties, First Nations title, bilateral disputes, and federal-provincial arrangements that the restriction documents describe in the language of legal frameworks rather than the language of access. The third reason is harder to name cleanly. It is the reason that applies to Resolution Island and to the Experimental Lakes Area, and, partially, to every site on this list, where the restriction reflects not only what the government wants to protect, but what it wants to control the narrative around. Protected areas produce protected knowledge. The islands where the data is collected, where the colonies breed, undisturbed, where the contamination sits in the sediment, and the monitoring continues, and the remediation reports are filed, those places are not restricted arbitrarily. They are restricted because the unrestricted version of each of them produces a different kind of information. The information is what is actually being managed. These islands are where it lives.